But tonight we're really excited to talk with Kristen Cannon from Children's just on this topic of anxiety and how important that is. Because I don't think any of us can relate to that right now as adults, let alone our kids. So anyway, technically, yeah, if you, for the most part, probably just keep your mute on and you can use the chat box, but we actually have time reserved at the end for questions. So if you want to mostly hold on to them, or even if you chat in there, and then Kristen could probably address them in the back half, any questions that people may have, and would be happy to make this as interactive as possible. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kristen.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys all for coming today. I'm glad you're able to tune in. More people join as we go, and I'll let them in, but I'm glad you're all here. My name is Kristen Cannon. I'm a psychiatry resident, currently completing my adult psychiatry training at Ohio State University, but I also spent a lot of this year working with Nationwide Children's Hospital, specifically with their On Our Sleeves program, which aims to kind of raise awareness and reduce stigma about mental illness, especially in children. So today I'm going to be talking about anxiety. I'll start by just talking about what anxiety is, what it looks like, and then we'll kind of get a little bit more into this topic of resilience, which is kind of a way to combat anxiety, and we'll apply it specifically to kids. A lot of this material, though, it applies to adults and kids. We've all experienced anxiety before. It's something that we're all kind of continuously striving to learn how to deal with. So I'll go ahead and get started. Bear with me, I'm not super familiar with virtual presentations. I think we're all still kind of familiarizing ourselves with this format. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to make sure that we've got some time to chat at the end. All right, so part one, anxiety. What is anxiety? Anxiety is an emotion, but it's also the body's response to stress. So there's an emotional component to anxiety, but there's also a physical component to anxiety. And anxiety is it's one of the first emotions that we feel. Everybody has felt anxiety. Babies feel anxiety, little kids feel anxiety, adults still feel anxiety. It's normal to experience this emotion and this reaction. So while some anxiety is normal, if it gets too extreme, anxiety can be disruptive. It can get to the point where it's considered an anxiety disorder. But before we kind of talk about that, I wanted to talk about the purpose of anxiety. It's something that can be really useful. It can help keep us safe in dangerous situations. It can help keep us safe if we're, running from a bear, for example. So there's definitely situations where anxiety is moving. Like in this scenario, especially in the early days of humanity, anxiety was probably somewhat useful. It causes our sympathetic nervous system to kick in. So if you kind of remember back to your high school biology days, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is what kicks in when you're feeling anxiety, when you're exposed to stress. So your entire body becomes equipped to deal with the one goal of getting away from danger, getting away from the thing that is stressing you out. So all of the kind of peripheral functions in your body, they get put on hold. Those don't matter when you're running from a bear. So your digestion, for example, digesting food isn't important right now. If the only goal is to get away from danger. So your pupils will dilate, your heart will race. A lot of times people have this adrenaline rush. They're able to run faster than normal. They almost feel stronger than normal. So this is definitely beneficial in the short term if there's an extremely dangerous situation that you need to get away from. It becomes a problem though when your sympathetic nervous system is on all the time. That's not what it was designed for. So if your body is always focused on getting away from stress, then it's ignoring other really important functions, like digestion. It can cause long-term health problems. It can cause gastrointestinal problems. It can cause frequent headaches. There's very legitimate physical symptoms that happen to your body when it's constantly in the sympathetic nervous system. And at a certain point, it can also become an anxiety disorder. Here's just a couple examples of what can happen to your body when it's constantly exposed to stress. So upset stomach, headaches, irritability, and it can affect your brain as well. It can cause depression, panic attacks. It can get to the point of being considered an anxiety disorder. So as far as just the classification of anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety disorder, it's defined as an excessive anxiety or worry occurring more days than not. It also involves at least 3 of the symptoms that are listed here: restlessness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, or problems sleeping. This is one of the most common mental illnesses for both adults and adolescents and children. People can develop generalized anxiety disorder at any age. 32% of all adolescents in America will experience an anxiety disorder at some point. And over 30% of adults will experience an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. So it's pretty even between adolescents and adults of who has greater rates of generalized anxiety disorder. It's common across various age ranges. So why does this happen to some people and not happen to others? We're all exposed to stress. We all experience anxiety sometimes. Why are some people able to cope with it and other people find it debilitating, find it constantly interrupting their lives? It's important to note that generalized anxiety disorder does have a really strong genetic association. A lot of people are simply predisposed to having generalized anxiety disorder. But in addition to this predisposition, life events can kind of push on that. Someone who's predisposed to generalized anxiety disorder but lives a relatively stress-free life and isn't exposed to a lot of stressors may never develop the disorder. While people who are constantly exposed to stressors are more likely to develop it. And that's because of this little part of your brain called the amygdala. It's responsible for storing emotional memories. So when you're constantly exposed to stress, your brain hangs on to that. It remembers that, and it applies that information to new situations. So if you're someone who, for example, has been chased by a bear before, you're more likely to hear a rustling in the bushes and assume that's a bear, as opposed to someone who's never been chased by a bear before. They might not have that immediate fight or flight system kick in when they hear a rustling in the bushes. So, exposure to stress that is significant, that really does contribute to the probability of developing an anxiety disorder. And a lot of us have been exposed to stressors lately. In fact, 2020 was considered by historians to be one of the most stressful years in all of both American and world history. I believe it was in the top 10 of most stressful years in American history. So we're all stressed out right now. Grown-ups are stressed out, kids are stressed out, teenagers are stressed out. For different reasons, of course. Obviously, being in the midst of a global pandemic is stressful. A lot of us are worried about our health, and we're worried about the health of family members. But it's more than that. Finances are actually considered a major stressor for adults. And one of the main things that adults with generalized anxiety disorder spend time feeling anxious about. And obviously, there have been financial implications of the pandemic. Children and adolescents with generalized anxiety disorder often worry about academics, and they worry about peer relationships. Again, 2 things that have been significantly affected this past year. Adolescents aren't able to, or haven't been able to, go hang out with their friends like they used to be able to do. They don't have, the social exposure that they were used to. And adjusting to online learning has also been really stressful for a lot of kids. So we've all been stressed out. We've all had exposure to stressors, and that increases the likelihood of developing an anxiety disorder. So that kind of leads me to part 2, because I don't want it to be all doom and gloom. What I've said so far kind of makes it seem like we're pretty much powerless to developing anxiety disorders and to kind of the ongoing effects of those disorders, because you can't control your genetic predisposition. And you can't really control your exposure to stressors. You can do what you can to avoid them, but at the end of the day, the stressors you're exposed to, that's not your fault. You aren't responsible for what the world does to you and puts on you. So are we powerless? Not entirely. I wanted to talk a little bit about resilience. So resilience is defined as the quick recovery of one's well-being after a stressor. Resilience is something that can be learned. That's really important to note here. It's not a personality trait. It's not like we have a certain resilience gene, and some people just are resilient and can bounce back really fast, and some people just aren't, and there's nothing they can do about it. It is something that can be learned over time. It's also not the opposite of anxiety exactly. So I don't want to communicate the idea that resilience is something that people with generalized anxiety disorder don't have. Like it's in some way their fault that they didn't develop the skill. That's not quite the case. People with generalized anxiety disorders can be very resilient. It's kind of like they just have more things that they have to learn to be resilient from. So it's harder, it's certainly harder to learn resilience when you've got stressor after stressor coming at you, and when you're someone who's predisposed genetically to generalized anxiety disorder. It can be hard, but it's certainly not impossible. You can have generalized anxiety disorder or another anxiety disorder, and at the same time be a resilient person. It's kind of about diminishing the effects that anxiety disorder has on you. It's learning to cope with it, learning to bounce back quickly, learning to keep it under control. So I like metaphors. I wanted to kind of further explain this with a metaphor. I've mentioned both stress and anxiety a lot during this talk, and I wanted to make sure I clearly differentiate between those two. Stress is external. Stress is something that happens to you, either something at work. Stress is, getting stuck in traffic. It's an event. So if you're a weightlifter, stress is like the weight that you've got to lift here. Anxiety is internal, though. Anxiety is your response to the stressor. So that's kind of like your body's response to lifting a weight, which is probably going to be fatigue. If you're like me, it's probably going to be a lot of muscle soreness because I'm not used to lifting weights. It's what happens to your body after the fact. And then an anxiety disorder is kind of comparable to having a physical ailment that would make your body's response even stronger, or that would make lifting weights even harder. So somebody who's got bad knees, somebody who's got arthritis, that's like having an anxiety disorder. It's going to make lifting weights even harder. But again, not impossible. Resilience in this metaphor is like physical conditioning. It's something anyone can learn over time. It's something that's going to be a lot harder for people who've got arthritis or a physical condition, but again, not impossible. And with proper training, with proper work over time, your body can become stronger and you can become more and more capable of lifting heavier weights and not feeling that fatigue and that soreness in your body after you lift those weights. So I hope that kind of clearly explains the concept of resilience, but how in the world do we actually develop this skill? And more importantly, how do we teach children to develop this skill? I know it seems kind of complicated, but raising resilient kids is something that's definitely possible, and it's really important because most skills, and this is no exception, are much easier to learn in childhood. So raising resilient kids, kind of instilling that in them when they're young, can really set them up on a path for success. So how do we actually do this though? A couple of things. So watch the way that you talk about yourself around your kids. That's the first thing. Kids are paying more attention than you realize. If you are engaging in a lot of negative self-talk, they're going to notice and they're going to think that that's an appropriate response to stress. If you are saying, I'm terrible at this or that, and it's clearly causing you visible distress, they're going to notice and they're going to probably, in their eyes, adults know everything and adults can do anything. So when an adult is making statements like that, they'll compare themselves and they'll say, well, if mom or dad is terrible at XYZ, then what am I? So it is important to watch the way that you talk about yourself around kids. Also get used to the phrase, but that's okay because. So while it's important to watch the way you talk and behave around kids, it's not really realistic to never be anxious in front of your kids. They'll see you feel anxious and they'll see you be exposed to stress. So it's okay to communicate, I feel overwhelmed right now, but that's okay because I'm just going to do my best to get through this. Kind of normalize that response. Normalize failure too. There's kind of two extreme approaches when it comes to kiddos and failure. Some parents will have a really strong reaction to their kids messing up, and kids will kind of internalize that and feel like something like losing a soccer game is the end of the world. Some parents can be very, very blunt about their children failing, and then some parents may try to shield their children from failure entirely. May not want them to play win-lose sports, for example. Exposure to failure is important, but it's equally important that kids realize failure is okay. Failure does not have to be scary. The world doesn't end after a failure. So again, it's kind of that, but that's okay because, you lost this game, but that's okay because now you know what you need to work on, because at the end of the day, it's just a soccer game and you still get to go out for ice cream with your team afterwards. Failure is okay. We can learn from failure. Somebody who's resilient views so-called failures as an opportunity to learn and to grow and to improve. The most important thing you can do too is just be supportive and present. So at the end of the day, everyone is trying their best to be a good parent and to raise resilient kids. But at the end of the day, just having one strong supportive relationship with a trusted adult is what's going to make a kid more resilient than anything. It's going to make them feel more empowered to deal with stressors. So just being there and being present. And then a couple of practical things you can do with kids. And if you go to the On Our Sleeves website, you can probably find a lot more information about specific activities if you want to sit down with your kid and talk to them about resilience and try to foster resilience. One activity is making an emotion list. So if you want your kiddos to be resilient, it's not just about bouncing back from anxiety, it's about bouncing back from all sorts of negative emotions. So encourage them to identify their emotions. That's the first step. You can't really bounce back from an emotion if you don't understand what's happening, if you don't understand what you're feeling. So one thing you can do is try to write down as many emotion words as you can think of, or encourage your kid to do this. And this is something adults can do as well. It's something that can be helpful for us. I think a lot of people struggle with emotion identification. Sometimes feelings can just feel so intense and so overwhelming that we don't really know how to name them. So write down as many emotion words as you can think of. Try to categorize them under broad categories though. So kind of the umbrella emotions like joy, fear, sadness, anger, love, and surprise. And then discuss the subtle differences between the emotion words that are in the same category. So what's the difference between upset versus distraught? What's the difference in the way your body feels when you're upset versus distraught? And then, happy versus elated. What's the difference? And then encourage your child to identify situations, and those can be either real or imagined, that would cause them to feel these emotions. That's kind of the first and most important step to developing resilience, is just developing awareness and familiarity with the emotions that you're feeling. And then another one is just teaching skills for emotional regulation. So you identify the emotion, okay, what do you do with it? What do you do with a negative emotion? What do you do about that? So there's a couple different strategies that can be really useful for helping someone's body and mind return to a state of calm or joy when they're feeling anxious or when they're feeling sad. Movement or exercise is a great strategy. Again, remember, anxiety is very physical. It's not just happening in your mind, it's happening in your body. So, encourage your kid to move around and move their body in a healthy and productive way. Some kids, when they're anxious, will feel, they'll feel very physically overwhelmed. They might punch pillows, punch walls, that's certainly not uncommon. So encourage them to move their body in a healthy, productive way. Go for a walk, do a workout. Encourage deep breathing activities. There's a couple of different specific examples of deep breathing activities. Breathing in for 5 seconds, holding your breath, and then breathing out for 5 seconds, something of that sort, just kind of timing it, being very intentional, being aware and present as you're doing the breathing exercise. Listening to music, that can actually be incredibly helpful in emotional regulation. Music makes us feel things. So encourage your kiddo to make a couple of separate playlists. For example, they might have a playlist that's really upbeat, that could help them feel joyful when they're starting to feel sad. But also have a playlist that's very calming, very relaxing. That might be the go-to playlist for when they're feeling anxious. So just any type of music that makes them feel those positive emotions. And then, the most important thing you could do is talk to your kids, be supportive, and be open and honest. You can share experiences that you've had in the past that made you feel anxious, that made you feel sad, and share the strategies that have worked for you. Everybody's different. So if you have some strategies that were really effective, talk to your kids. So that's pretty much it. That's all that I wanted to talk with you all about today. I know a lot of this is very broad. Again, the On Our Sleeves website has a lot more specific information about developing resilience. We all experience anxiety. We all experience anxiety sometimes on a daily or weekly basis, and that's normal. Too much anxiety can have serious physical and emotional consequences, especially in young children. And resilience, I just really wanted to stress again that resilience is something we're all capable of learning and helps us recover quickly from stress. So I'll go ahead and open it up now if anybody has any questions. Let's see, there looks like there may be something in the chat. Feel free to shout out questions. Let's see. How do you help your kid overcome their anxiety of staying in a new place and of meeting new people? So one of the most important things when you're talking to your kid about anxiety, I think, is validation. I didn't really touch on that a lot during this talk. New places and meeting new people can be scary. So starting out by saying, it's okay that you feel this way, it's okay that you feel anxious, I think is really important. I think it'll encourage your kids to be more open and honest with you in the future. But at the same time, challenge their thoughts. Something you can do, kind of a cognitive behavioral exercise, is, you've identified their anxiety, that's their emotion. What are the specific thoughts? What are the specific thoughts fueling that anxiety? So what is it about the new place or meeting the new people that they worry, that will actually happen? A lot of the times those thoughts, when you write them out and look at them, you can realize that they're not necessarily rational. I'm worried that these new people won't like me. That's really common. Well, why wouldn't they like you? Try to kind of encourage your kid, provide them with examples of, back when we lived here, all of these children liked you, you had lots of friends, people got along with you well. So what makes you think that won't necessarily be the case here? That can go a lot of different directions, and be patient with your kid because it might not happen right away. But sometimes, especially with some of the older kids, just kind of confronting them gently and lovingly and in a validating way, but saying, like, what is it? What is it specifically? What is the thought that is causing the anxiety about the situation? What do you really think that could happen? And it might help them sort of connect the dots and realize that the fear isn't necessarily a rational fear. That helps. Anything else? All right. I know we finished up kind of early. Again, I really appreciate everybody's time today. I hope that this was helpful or encouraging in some way. Thank you. All right, I'll go ahead and let y'all go.